Arthur, tell us a bit of the story of why you're here.
So we've brought a film called The Six to Asian Side. I've been to Asian Side before, but I haven't brought this film before. Just under a year ago, we pitched The Six at Guangzhou Doc Fest. It did really well, and about 10 months on now, we have over 50% of the funding, we have a broadcaster on board, and so we're looking for other regions of the world that might be interested. Yeah. So originally, what happened is we were due to attend, and just last night, we found that we're now in the pitch sessions as well.
I see.
Very exciting.
Have you done already the pitching?
No, it's on Wednesday.
Oh, Wednesday.
That's
okay.
Right.
So,
That's right.
What's the synopsis? What's the story? The Six.
So The Six is the story of the 6 Chinese survivors of Titanic. So it's a completely untold story. They are, in fact, the only survivors of Titanic, of whom there are over 700. But they're the only ones whose story has never been touched on, whose names are basically unknown, and who disappeared within 24 hours of arriving in New York when the survivors arrived. And so we've set out to see if we can find what happened to them, how did they survive, and where they ended up, and why no one has ever claimed them as family.
What was the inspiration of doing this story? How did it come to you?
I work, my last film was a historical documentary about the search for a lost British submarine off the coast of China. So this came along because the man I was working with on that film, our main researcher and who featured in the film, Stephen Schwankert, is a maritime historian and author based in Beijing. And he came across this story and began to pitch it to me. And initially I was a little skeptical, saying, another Titanic documentary, I mean, who's going to want that? But when I began to tell people about it, everyone was like, so this is a crazy story. Where did they end up? Where did they end up? You know, how do we not know them? You know, when I grew up in a small town in England, and in this very small town, across the village green from us was an old house with an old woman who lived there, and we all knew she'd been on Titanic. I mean, wherever Titanic survivors are, they're very well known, and their kids are well known, and they still get interviewed at the 100-year anniversary and you know, anything that's connected. And yet the six Chinese survivors had never been touched upon as a story, didn't feature in any of the major films, and we thought that a new story, something completely unknown, that tells of the immigrants' experience, the migrants' experience of not only Titanic, but life in that swirling mass of immigration that happened in the early 20th century, we thought was a kind of exciting prospect.
Why documentary? Why not film or motion picture?
It's a good question. I retain the right. I think, you know, at some point we'd love to have someone on board. I mean, I guess the natural base for that would be a Chinese production company, one of the big Chinese film production bases. So we thought, just make it viable first. Why? Let's get the story out there. Let's make sure we have the facts, because this wasn't like it landed on our plate. We didn't say, well, here's a story, let's just tell it. We've had to go back to the beginning. I mean, literally not one of these people had ever been researched. We were the first people to find their descendants, and so it was something that required, you know, months of work, a lot of research, and we're still not quite there yet, but we're well enough down the road to realize that we have something kind of extraordinary. I mean, these are incredible people who ended up having to live very controlled lives, because many of them ended up sneaking back into America to get back in where they were initially, where they landed with Carpathia, the ship that rescued them. Going back in, ending up in all sorts of parts of the world, touching on the First World War, touching on Civil War in China. Their lives were extraordinary, and many of them, we now know, never told anyone that this had happened to them.
What would be the message from this piece of work to the audience?
For us, it's a question of reclaiming history. You know, there are so many of these big events, and you'd think Titanic, I mean, all the stories have been told, but we felt like the idea of taking an Asian story, and specifically, in this case, a Chinese story, and saying, you know what, there is a Chinese story in Titanic, was just something kind of extraordinary. So the idea of looking at something that we think we all know and finding a new angle on it, something very exciting to me as a filmmaker.
And how important is Asian side of the doc for you as a filmmaker?
Well, it's sort of crucial. I mean, because the way that we pull the money together to make a film like this is very piecemeal. And off the back of Guangzhou, which was very successful, we had amazing feedback. We've ended up with over half the budget in place. But coming to somewhere like Asian side, we have the chance to touch on broadcasters and distributors from all over the world. And hopefully they see the potential in something like this, especially when there's some budget in place already and some chance for broadcast. Asian side's, I think, the perfect place to bring a project like this.
What's the impression so far for this event being held in Bangkok?
Well, it's a great venue, lovely place. I mean, the people are very welcoming. I think it's perfect, and I'm excited to be back in Thailand.
I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right.